March 18, 2025. Good evening, I'm Samuel B. Williams. Welcome to Equal Ground Headlines. Ceasefire gambit as war rages in Ukraine. Turning overseas now. A dramatic diplomatic gamble is underway even as fierce fighting continues in Ukraine. President Donald Trump says he will speak with Russia's Vladimir Putin on Tuesday morning in a high-stakes bid to halt the Russia-Ukraine war. It's an extraordinary turn in a conflict now grinding through its fourth year of all-out combat. Trump is pushing a 30-day ceasefire plan that Ukraine's government has already agreed to in principle. The hope is that a short truce could open the door to broader peace. I think we'll be able to do it, Trump said confidently about brokering peace. But as diplomatic phones ring, the situation on the battlefield grows only more dire, and there are deep doubts about the Kremlin's sincerity. On the ground, the war rages unabated. Overnight, and into this morning, both Russian and Ukrainian forces launched heavy aerial attacks. Air raid sirens wailed across multiple Ukrainian cities. In President Zelensky's hometown of Kryvyi, a Russian missile slammed into a residential block, injuring at least 11 civilians, including children. Apartment buildings were left in flames, and families were rushed to shelters in the pre-dawn darkness. Ukraine's Air Force reports that Moscow sent an unprecedented swarm of armed drones, nearly 180 in total, into Ukrainian airspace in a single night. Many were shot down, but dozens still struck targets, knocking out power in parts of Odessa and Dnipropetrovsk. Russian forces, for their part, claim they intercepted over 100 Ukrainian drones that targeted border regions deep inside Russia. This drone duel marks a new phase of the conflict, with each side increasingly carrying the fight to the other's skies. Fighting has intensified on the ground in a surprising locale. Russian territory. For months, Ukrainian troops had established a tenuous foothold in Russia's Kursk region, a bold incursion beyond Ukraine's own borders. Now, Moscow is throwing its might to root them out. Russia's defense ministry today announced its units have recaptured several villages in western Kursk, pushing back the Ukrainian incursion. The operation has been brutal. Russia even evacuated hundreds of civilians from the area, signaling how pitched the battle became. By Russia's account, the Ukrainian force in Kursk is surrounded and running low on supplies. Putin himself issued a public call for those Ukrainian soldiers to surrender, vowing they would be spared if they lay down arms. In a somber address, he claimed this appeal was made out of sympathy, saying he acted after President Trump urged him to show mercy to the encircled troops. But Ukrainian commanders have given no indication they intend to give up. They know all too well the grim fate that might await their men in Russian captivity. Meanwhile, Ukraine's leadership is juggling war and diplomacy. President Volodymyr Zelensky cautiously welcomed the idea of a US-brokered ceasefire. But he has read lines. He declared that any peace talks must grapple with the hard issue of territory. In a defiant statement, Zelensky insisted Ukraine will never recognize Russian sovereignty over the lands Moscow has seized. That includes Crimea and parts of eastern Ukraine taken since 2014, as well as areas occupied in the current war. The message to the world: Ukraine may be willing to pause the fighting, but it won't trade away its homeland for peace. Zelensky has also moved to strengthen his team for any negotiations ahead. He appointed a new delegation to potentially meet the Russians, headed by his trusted chief of staff and including the foreign and defense ministers. At the same time, he's shuffling some top military posts, installing a new chief of general staff to reinvigorate Ukraine's defense. These changes suggest Kyiv is preparing for all scenarios, both a continued fight and a possible diplomatic endgame. Across the globe, allies and analysts remain wary of the Kremlin's intentions. Britain's Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, voiced what many are thinking, that Putin's talk of ceasefire might be a ploy. If Putin is serious about peace, it's very simple. He must stop his barbaric attacks now, Starmer said, noting that Russia's bombardment of Kyiv continued even as ceasefire talks swirled. But the European Union's foreign policy chief was even more blunt. Kaja Kallas remarked that Russia's extreme preconditions for a truce show Moscow does not really want peace. And President Zelensky, in his nightly address to Ukrainians, accused Putin of deliberately prolonging the war. He pointed out that Moscow has known about the U.S. ceasefire proposal for over a week, yet has continued launching deadly attacks every day. Every day of war means more lives lost, Zelensky said, suggesting that if Putin truly wanted to end the bloodshed, he would have acted by now. Still, the upcoming Trump-Putin call marks the most significant diplomatic effort in many months. There is talk of what concessions might be on the table. Trump himself hinted that we'll be talking about land. We'll be talking about power plants in the negotiations. A reference to contested territories and facilities like the Russian-occupied Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant. Putin's regime has consistently demanded that Ukraine renounce any NATO ambitions and accept neutrality as part of a peace deal. In return, Ukraine would expect Russia to withdraw troops, a tall order given Putin's insistence on holding strategic gains. The US has signaled that European nations stand ready to help if a ceasefire takes hold. In fact, both the EU and the UK have floated plans to send international peacekeepers to Ukraine to monitor any truce and secure humanitarian corridors. Such a deployment would be historic. Armed peacekeepers from Europe on Ukrainian soil. Something unthinkable before this war. For war-weary Ukrainians, the prospect of silence on the battlefront, even briefly, is a beacon of hope. But there's also fear. Fear that a pause in fighting could simply give the Russians time to regroup for an even deadlier offensive. Ukrainian officials emphasize that they have agreed only to a temporary ceasefire, not a lasting peace that freezes the conflict in place. As the diplomatic gambit unfolds, the world watches with bated breath. Will there be a breakthrough to finally still the guns, or will this war's tragic cycle of attack and counterattack continue? By tomorrow, we may have our first hints. Samuel B. Williams, Equal Ground Headlines, on the Ukraine front lines where the quest for peace confronts the grim reality of war.